as is the tradition in Canada, we want to acknowledge that Brigham Young University sits on the traditional homelands of the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples, and we thank them for the opportunity to live and work here. Professor Anderson is in Edmonton, obviously, right now, and so we also want to acknowledge that where he is, the University of Alberta is situated on Treaty 6 territory, which are the traditional lands of both First Nations and Métis people in Canada. When their histories, languages, and cultures influence the University of Alberta and the great city of Edmonton. So with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Anderson, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. He became a member of that faculty in 2000 and received his PhD in 2005 from the Department of Sociology at the U of A. In 2014, he was awarded full professorship. He is the former director of the Rupert's Land Center for Métis Research, and additionally served as the interim institutional co-lead of Indigenous initiatives for the University of Alberta. Dr. Anderson is the author of 2 books, including with Maggie Walter, Indigenous Statistics, a Quantitative Indigenous Methodology, and Métis Race Recognition in the Struggle for Indigenous Peoplehood. In 2015, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association awarded that book the prize for best subsequent book in Native American and Indigenous Studies. And in 2016, it was shortlisted for the Canada Prize, which is a very prestigious book award in Canada. With Jean O'Brien, he also co-edited the recently published Sources and Methods in Indigenous Studies. Dr. Anderson was a founding member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, Executive Council, is a member of Statistic Canada's Advisory Committee on Social Conditions, and is the editor of the journal Aboriginal Policy Studies. In 2014, he was named as an inaugural member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. And so with that, we welcome Dean Anderson to give this talk. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kevin. Can everyone hear me all right? Thumbs up? Perfect. I should start off by saying that I'm terrible when it comes to technology, and so it never occurred to me when I shared screen that I wouldn't actually be able to read off of the paper that I had created. So therefore, you'll see me like this for most of the time because I have papers that I'll be reading off, and also I've actually written out my talk today because as I get older, I tend to extemporize more and more, and I find if I don't write stuff out on paper, my talks go anywhere between 35 minutes and an hour and 40 minutes. So this will keep my extemporizing hopefully to a dull roar. But I will try and look up every once in a while so that you can tell that I haven't frozen. I'd like to begin by thanking Kevin and Stan for their kind invitation to present this year's Palmer Lecture in Canadian Studies at BYU. And I'd also like to thank Brenda McDougall, Nicole St. Ange, Robert Innes, David Parent, Katie Pollock, and others who have engaged with me in discussions around these issues. Hopefully their generosity to engage with my naive thoughts on this will have made the talk today less not great, for lack of a better term. I should be honest too that I bounced back and forth on how to pitch the talk between, on the one hand, kinship, and on the other hand, nationhood and peoplehood. And as it turns out, I'm not smart enough at the moment to connect my thoughts on all 3 concepts simultaneously, though for an elegant discussion on the links between kinship and Indigenous nationhood, I would direct you to Jennifer Daisy's work. And so I finally decided again to focus just on kinship, but instead of focusing just on Métis material culture in that context, the talk will include discussion about the treacherousness of maps and how to think about Métis presences and absences on the maps that purport to frame Indigenous territoriality in the British Museum exhibit that I'm going to talk about today, and the manner in which the powerful and enduring role of racialization and kinship juxtapositions, how that shapes Métis presences and absences therein. To provide some background, my talk has its conceptual origins, and I suppose to borrow from Roland Barthes' discussion of the power of the photograph, its punctum 15 years ago in London. More specifically, it began in room 26 of the British Museum, a prestigious centuries-old neo-Roman building in the ritzy Bloomsbury area of central London that attracts millions of visitors every year. Room 26 houses the J.P. Morgan Chase Gallery North America exhibit, And the British Museum's promotional material tells us that this exhibit, and here, oh, perfect, it worked, explores the different cultural identities of Native North American people from ancient times to the present, including the effect of European contact and colonization on Native North American communities, unquote. And I hope you all understand why I have the sick in front, or I guess behind people. The exhibit includes an impressive display of material culture artifacts from the Northern Plains, including what Canada now claims as Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as well as several American states that border the US-Canadian border. Also included are 2 large maps, which serve as important contextual devices for understanding the Indigenous territorial configurations of mid-19th century Northern Plains and subarctic Indigenous society, within which the material culture is located. The first time I visited the British Museum, I went as a naive tourist and was surprised and excited to see that they had a North American exhibit, and further, that a large amount of curatorial exhibition space was being given to parts of the Northern Plains that my people, the Métis, are from. When I finally made it to the exhibit rooms, the first thing that drew my eye was a large map of the region. You'll see from the slide that a number of Indigenous peoples are highlighted, including their territorial ranges. What is, of course, missing was any Métis territorial presence. I found this, as the saying goes, shocking but not surprising. Despite our central role in shaping 19th century Northern Plains in Canada, Métis continue to inhabit a relatively small space in the imagination of museum curators. And what space we do inhabit tends to take the form of pinning our collective tail to the donkey of mixed ancestry. In my talk today, I want to spend some time positioning London, and by extension the British Museum, as what Anthony Giddens calls a power container, and what that means for the duty of care and responsibility that curators possess, and having talked to several of them, definitely feel, for the galleries and the exhibits that get displayed there. From there, I'll spend some time talking about the role that kinship played and what Cree scholar Robert Alexander Innes has termed the multicultural band society of the Northern Plains, and how racializing the Métis in terms of our apparently unique mixed ancestry makes it easy to narrate into material culture terms like hybridity or mixedness, rather than in terms of our kinship relationships to other Indigenous people. And can I just pause here to say how freaking weird it is to kind of be talking into a void for any of you who are teaching or giving presentations in other, it's just weird. There's no way to get, and not like wonderfully weird, like, you know, black licorice ice cream you can get in Denmark. It's just like weird. So I just want to point that out now. Following that discussion, I'll then discuss the lack of Métis presence on the contextualizing display maps, talk about the problems that any map maker, regardless of how sympathetic they might be, will encounter trying to map out shared Indigenous territories. Then end with some queries to museum curators and those interested in writing on museum curation about what a stronger emphasis on shared kinship relationships might look like when creating exhibits material culturally and narratively. Before I begin, though, I want to point out how I'm using terms like racialization and kinship. I and others in the field of Métis studies often write about how the term Métis appears to exist in the academic imagination, somewhere on a spectrum between 2 conceptual poles, or within 2 conceptual poles. On the one hand, there is a racialized positioning of the term Métis as an acceptable catch-all category for Indigenous individuals and groups of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestry, aside from the fact that that's pretty much everybody by the end of the 19th century. We'll leave that aside. Regardless of what they call themselves, and in fact, regardless of whether evidence exists of a they outside of an archival artifice. And on the other end of the spectrum, the term Métis is positioned in more nationalist terms as a post-contact Indigenous people who rose to prominence on the Northern Plains of what is now roughly Western Canada at the beginning of the 19th century, and who lived in relation to other Indigenous peoples of the Northern Plains. The Métis were part of the Nihiapuat, the Iron Alliance, and lived in partnership with the Saulteaux, the Cree, and the Assiniboine. The term Métis is defined in this context. The term Métis, as defined in this context, is thus associated not with notions of racially mixed individuals, but instead with specific leaders, events, geographical territories, economy, land tenure, artistic styles, language, and of particular importance here, kinship connections. And you'll see in the slide I put up here, the way that one easy way to kind of think about a role that racialization plays is when things are turned into sort of individual categories rather than kind of collective discussions. So in a racialized context, and for me, as for many people that write in critical race theory, race doesn't produce racialization. Racialization produces races. It's a particular lens, particular categories for looking at the world. But in a racialized context, Métis is irreducibly reduced to this idea of mixedness. Therefore, Métis is less than, as opposed to thinking about this in a more relational context and kinship, the way that I'm talking about it, Métis are relational and are collective. Following from this, my understanding of kinship adopts parts of Métis historian Brenda McDougall's sophisticated discussion of kinship, in which she notes that the term, quote, is about understanding a collective experience of interfamilial and intercommunity relations. She undertakes a far more complex discussion of the various paths that kinship studies have taken. But what's important for us here is understanding the conceptual importance of relatedness to understanding the idea of Métis collectively. Indeed, what I'll get into further as the talk proceeds is how racialization offers a conceptual path for presenting racial logics in the place of kinship, relational ones. And that presentation pathway carries within it as well the power of erasure. Before I get into the meat of this discussion, though, let me begin in a slightly more prosaic place, which is situating the power of museums in capital cities. Before my mid-30s, and I'll make a joke that'll probably only be funny to me slightly later in the talk, but I'll let you know kind of how old I am. Before my mid-30s, I had never been to Europe, which is apropos of not much, given that there are people the world over who've never been to Europe and or have never been afforded the privileged life that would allow them to travel to Europe for leisure. I'm Métis from a large Métis family in Saskatchewan, which is a relatively sparsely populated province in Western Canada. Oh, and I want to pause here to say hello to some of my Métis cousins who have said that they're going to tune in today and who don't know it yet, but they're about to be bored to tears, but just saying hello to them now if they did end up coming. In addition to being Métis, I have Danish ancestry on my father's side. I know next to nothing about Danish culture, aside from our dad presenting us with some interesting food choices as children. But from the mid-2000s, I was able to reconnect with Danish relatives, which I've continued to do since then. All of this is to say that I have a complex relationship with Europe. I think most of us who have traveled to Europe can agree that it has some beautiful cities, interestingly laid out with stunning old world architecture, which many of my buzzkill Indigenous colleagues will legitimately point out is what happens when we account for the colonial backdrops of many of these countries, whose economies often relied on the wealth and the resources of Indigenous peoples and our territories, bringing them back to Europe, varying amounts of which were eventually shoveled into their public infrastructures. European cities in this sense are power containers. Sociologist Anthony Giddens defined power containers in the context of the ancient world as, quote, circumscribed areas for the generation of administrative power. A locale is a power container insofar as it permits a concentration of allocative and authoritative resources. Class-divided societies, castles, manorial estates, but above all cities are containers for the generation of power, unquote. Now, admittedly, Giddens' prose doesn't exactly lend itself to late night reading with a glass of wine and a bubble bath, but his overall point remains salient. Cities, and capital cities in particular, are distinctive from other cities and are perhaps even special. Capital cities not only represent where the nation meets the state in any given nation state, they sit at both the center and the periphery of an increasingly globalized world. That is to say, as Barbier does, that capital cities are special even from other power containers within a particular nation state, in that they are both a symbolic home of the nation and a gateway to a number of different nations. In other words, they are at once intensely national, but also irreducibly cosmopolitan. Capital cities are thus nexuses of a number of different kinds of power and resources that concentrate in their geopolitical space. One way to think about this is in terms of a heart muscle whose beats pull in and push out people, goods, and cultural values and meanings. And I'm not one who necessarily values the use of physical metaphors to explain social dynamics, but this one seems especially fitting, as I'll return to in a moment. Of specific relevance to my talk today, part of the concentration of resources that congeal in capital cities in particular are those relating to heritage and tourism. In this context, although it's probably important to note that the containment of capitals is rarely haphazard, indeed it is often exceedingly controlled, more relevant for my talk today is that the power of colonialism makes it very clear that capital cities are not just power containers, they are power depositories. And especially in a heritage context, much of what tourists are directed to see in capital cities originate from elsewhere. Remember again the heartbeat analogy I gave a moment ago. As people, goods, and meanings were drawn into the capital, one of the places they remain are in heritage institutions. And as I'll speak specifically about today, museums. That's foreshadowing. Now, of course, it's important to note that museums never do just one thing or play just one role. I say foreshadowing, but I don't do English in film or any of that kind of stuff, so I don't actually know whether it's foreshadowing. I just heard someone else say it as a joke earlier. So if I was actually presenting in person right now, I'd be drawing energy from the audience with my goofy jokes, but now it's just me being goofy, so I'll probably stop that. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Now, of course, it's important to note that museums never do just one thing or play just one role. To the extent that museology has justifiably positioned museums as forms of power, it's equally important to note that they are also forums of power, the result of complex engagement with numerous constituents and stakeholders. Thus, although they are spaces of tourist attraction, insofar as capitals represent and even stand in for the nation, and insofar as nationalist museums are located often in national cities, they can and often do represent dominant discourses about the nation as well. They tell national stories, the material culture they display, and the narratives around which that material culture is wrapped. In doing so, museums can play a key role in producing and reproducing nationalism and the nation form. And as Ashley has argued, quote, "What is shown in heritage sites and what is not shown can have a major impact on how society sees itself and presents itself to others," unquote. In short, museums act as a privileged locale in the reflection and the refraction of discourses about nationalism to the broader public. Additionally, as noted earlier, in crucial ways, museums also contain the symbolic and physical detritus of nation states' colonial pasts, as well as their narrations of those pasts. Insofar as many collections contain information and physical objects secured in less than honorable circumstances or contexts, of the wide variety of stories that can be told in museums that paint nation states in particular lights, only a few end up getting told in most museum settings. Museums are, in Lewis Mumford's provocative prose, libraries writ concrete, quote, "A method for gaining access through selected specimens and samples to a world whose immensity and complexity would otherwise be far beyond human power to grasp," unquote. Among the many collections that they possess, the British Museum has collated among the world's most extensive collections of ethnographic material from what Brits tend to call the Americas, exhibits of which are spread across several of its rooms. Though this collection includes artifacts from historical indigenous empires, nations, and confederacies, Maya, Inca, Aztec, as well as tribal nations from the Great Plains, and indigenous societies from the subarctic and Arctic geopolitical spaces, I'll be focusing today on one room in particular, which includes artifacts from geopolitical spaces now dominantly known to many in Canada and the United States. It was opened according to the British Museum's audio tour when the artifacts were moved back from the Museum of Mankind in the late 1990s. The exhibit was sponsored by a multi-million-dollar donation from an American financial institution and is broken into 6 broad geographical regions, including of interest to us today, the subarctic and plains regions. Now we can see from the screen cap of the Google Street View that the British Museum has handily provided that the Canadian Plains part of the exhibit contains a wide array of material culture artifacts, including a mix of everyday life and more ceremonial pieces. And if I could figure out how to use PowerPoint slides better, you would have got a better photo than this one, but for some reason I couldn't take it from where I had taken the screen cap to here, so you're just gonna have to live with this. The exhibit includes parsimonious descriptors of the items, placing them in their everyday cultural context, as well as fitting them into the broader narrative of the North American exhibit as a whole, with a focus on pre and peri-colonial items, as well as emphasizing the vast trade networks that characterize the North American Indigenous landscape. The exhibit also includes several cartographical representations of the region, i.e. historical maps, to territorially contextualize the material culture contained in the exhibit, neither of which contain any mention of the Métis. And yes, I will mention this probably 6 more times before the end of this talk, because it's what irritates me most deeply about this exhibit. So I want to note here the operational power of race in the context that we're discussing it today in 2 senses. And I think if I can sort of just do a brief digression here, it's important to understand the difference between what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu refers to as categories of practice and categories of analysis. We often talk about race, but race isn't, generally speaking, a category of practice. It's generally a category of analysis. It's a secondhand category that we use as a shorthand to make sense of more complex stuff. So most often people don't see race. People will see skin color, what hair looks like, cultural factors, comportment, the way that people carry themselves, religion, et cetera, et cetera. We'll all talk about those in the context of race, but generally we use race as a shorthand and we talk about race a lot, but we generally don't see race. And that becomes important for reasons if I remember correctly, I make clear in a moment. So 2 senses in which I'm using the term racialization today. First, as a means by which Métis material presence as an Indigenous collectivity is demoted to particular configurations of our ancestry. In this sense, rather than being invisibilized, race in the form of an emphasis on our mixed ancestry becomes a highly visible way not to talk about our kinship, let alone nationhood or political peoplehood in relation to other Indigenous peoples. All of these are manifestations, in essence, of a hierarchy of racial purity in effect at the British Museum, as in most museums the world over, in which Métis collective culture is dismissed in favor of a racial logic of mixed ancestry. And I'll turn to that now. Part 2, racialization, writ, room 26. The reduction of Métis material collectivity to mixed ancestry individuality. As part of its exhibit collection, the North American exhibit includes a, quote, Métis coat. I'm not a historian, a curator, or a museologist. Frankly, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing museologist correctly. And so I'll refrain from commenting on the veracity of the coat's description, although I will point out that having shared this coat with several more knowledgeable friends and colleagues might have occasioned some eye rolling in terms of its description. What I want to point out instead, more conceptually, is the racialization of the contextual explanation for the coat. In explaining the piece, the museum curators write, quote, in the early 1800s, a population mixed European and Native ancestry called Métis emerged on the Canadian plains. Descended from Cree and Ojibwe women and French, Canadian, and Scottish men, these people were hunters, trappers, and successful traders. Now, leaving aside for the fact that we get referred to as a population rather than a people, what's interesting about this description is that accompanying the description in the British Museum's helpful online search engine is a small list titled Production Ethnic Group, where they give whatever information is known about the ethnic group that the artifact comes from. And in this case, it lists with a question mark following each name 4 different Indigenous categories the coat might be linked to. Métis, question mark, Naskapi, question mark, Montagnais, question mark, and Ainu, question mark. A powerful racialization thus anchors the designation of this coat as Métis. Indeed, it makes logical sense that an understanding of Métis as mixed would allow for its connection to another Indigenous people in place, such as those listed questioningly in the description. Moreover, whether or not the code in question has been correctly identified, and there's good reason to think that its lineage is more complex and more ambiguous than its identifier would suggest, it is equally important for us to understand the broader context within which such a code would have been produced and what might have made it distinctly Métis. Métis were certainly of mixed Aboriginal and Native ancestry, even if we again quibble with the British Museum's description of our collectivity as a population, but so were many or even most Indigenous individuals on the 19th century Northern Plains. And this is especially the case if we think about the idea of mixedness beyond whiteness mixed with some form of indigeneity, because as I'll talk about in a second, multicultural band societies are reliant upon mixedness kind of as a sine qua non logic for their existence. So our mixedness on its own is not what made us Métis, and such racial designators impoverish the complex material culture of the Métis, which, as Sherry Farrell-Rosette and others have explored, produced a distinctive aesthetic style irreducible to something as simplistic as having possessed mixed ancestry. Now, of course, again, in fairness, mixed ancestry sometimes will function too as a second order category. People will use the term mixed ancestry as a way to talk to other people, but what mixed ancestry serves as kind of a signal for is either a different economic relationship to the society that they live in, or those kinds of things. Second, wiped off the map the erasure of Métis presence in the 19th century Northern Plains. In addition to the racially logicked erasure of collective Métis culture, in the example of material culture just provided, the British Museum North American exhibit includes several maps that purport to show Indigenous territoriality on the Northern Plains and subarctic toward the latter part of the 19th century. And I say the latter part of the 19th century because of some of the things they have drawn in there, but I'm not 100% sure that they knew that they were, drawing those things in there was dating the map in that way. In any case, these maps effectively erase Métis presence from 19th century Indigenous society on the Northern Plains, and as if it and we never existed. And if we look at these maps, which are a good deal more blurry than they look when they're smaller, but hopefully they still make the point that I need them to make. If we look at the map, it displays a number of clearly defined Indigenous tribes and territories. From roughly east to west and south to north, it includes Nakota, Plains Ojibwe, Assiniboine, Cree, and then members of the Blackfoot Confederacy. But no Métis. One of the people involved in the creation of the exhibit kindly took me for supper when I was there a while ago. And during our meal, I asked them about the lack of any cartographical presence of Métis. They sheepishly grimaced and remarked, well, we spent 5,000 pounds on the map. Perhaps we should have spent 10,000 pounds on it. So there's at least an acknowledgement on their part that the map probably wasn't as up to snuff as it could have been. This is a broader issue at play here as well, which I would argue also falls prey to racialized categorical logics. And that is the extent to which Indigenous relationships to place can be thought of in terms of tribes, or to state that slightly more spicily, in terms of tribal purity, as these maps emphasize. Tribal logics tend to rely on rationalities of clearly demarcated territories with kind of bright line differences between various tribes. This is a problem as a matter of logic, but it's also an issue in terms of how one might produce mapping that accounts for the actual substance of everyday life on the Northern Plains. In his book, Elder Brother and the Law of the People, for example, Cree scholar Robert Alexander Innes argues that, quote, contrary to the tribal view, most Aboriginal bands in the Northern Plains were kin-based and multicultural. Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, and Métis individuals shared similar cultural kinship practices that allowed them to integrate others into their bands, unquote. Innes argues further that band-based multiculturalism was made possible by, quote, the way in which kinship was practiced, and as such, a focus on tribal affiliation ignores the importance of kinship ties as a central unifying factor for Aboriginal groups on the Northern Plains. group formation was played out at the band level, not the tribal level. If kinship is key to understanding Indigenous group formation, we can add to this the work that Drs. Brenda McDougall and Nicole St. Ange have carried out in the context of tracking the mobility of some Métis, particularly those involved in various buffalo hunting brigades, and more generally, their discussions about the power of what they've called kinscapes. In their words, the sets of relational constellations within which connected Métis families existed relationally and economically, that powerfully shaped how we can make sense of territories, territorial sharing, and interrelations within and between Indigenous peoples more generally. Aside from the questions of whether any map could appropriately document the complexity of lived Indigenous relationships to place that characterized 19th century Indigenous life on the Northern Plains, it's thus important to think with Innes, McDougall, St. Ange, and others about what the British Museum's maps would have to look like, not just to demonstrate a respect for Métis territorial presence during this period and in this space, but for understanding Indigenous relationships to place more generally. To go back to McDougall's earlier discussion about the power of kinship for Métis, as for all Indigenous peoples living in that region, it becomes important for us to think about what kinship writ Cartesian looks like in map-making practice. In speaking with a friend and colleague, Métis archaeologist and cartographer Keisha Supernaut, she suggested that such work would be difficult, to say the least. And it's certainly beyond my expertise and my pay grade, but I would imagine, given the different ways that Indigenous peoples use land and the complex agreements that might have governed their collective use, that it would require a lot of different colors of pencil crayons and a lot of shading. And as I said earlier, the fact that I'm using pencil crayons as my frame of reference should indicate to all of you that I'm knocking on the door of 50 here pretty soon. In lieu of a conclusion. I say in lieu of a conclusion because after I wrote it, I wasn't actually sure that I was concluding anything or just going back to the punctum that I started this with, but I've covered my bases. So on the one hand, the issues of the British Museum's North American exhibit with respect to Métis indigeneity are obvious to those who know what to look for. One, the reduction, or if you prefer, the demotion, or if you prefer, the disrespect of a hub of Métis material culture to something individually produced and explained by reference to mixed ancestry. I would have said our mixed ancestry, but the museum's use of population doesn't even allow for that. And second, a complete dismissal of Métis presence on 19th century Northern Plains territorial landscapes. These are both clear examples of racialization. On the other hand, the issues with the British Museum's exhibit are structural rather than idiosyncratic to the exhibit itself. You can visit any number of museums, even in Canada and even in Western Canada, which has many Métis communities and a vibrant Métis public culture, and experience the forms of racialization that I detail in this talk. Métis are indelibly and distinctly mixed in ways that other Indigenous people are not. And this idea is baked into the cake of most exhibits and their narratives. And this racialized understanding produces predictable consequences. Ultimately, I suppose two questions are anchoring my talk. And they're both questions that I ask not with judgment, but with curiosity, because I am genuinely curious about the answer. First, what would it mean to think about the Métis in the 19th century in museological terms, as distinctly Indigenous but also as kin to other Indigenous peoples? So for example, if you go back to the 18th century, there would be discussion about, yeah, of course, the idea of Métis is linked to Indigenous people because of the mixed ancestry element. What I'm asking is, what would it look like to understand the Métis as existing in kinship with other Indigenous peoples while understanding Métis as ourselves fully Indigenous? And second, how would an emphasis on prioritizing kinship as the primary lens for understanding Indigenous life on the Northern Plains manifest itself in curatorial practices, materially as well as a matter of narrative? Failure to think about Métis in terms of kinship produces curatorial narratives such as the following. An example I draw from much closer to home, the RCMP Heritage Center in Regina. that writes, as you can see here, oh. This is what's going to be called anticlimactic. People of the Great Plains, many Indigenous people lived on the plains, the Cree, Nakota, Assiniboine, Dakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Sarcee, as well as the Blackfoot Confederacy of the Blood, Kainai, Blackfoot, and Piegan. A large population of Métis, descendants of European fur traders and First Nations women, lived on the northern plains in mobile camps and settlements. An estimated 10,000 lived in Red River Valley alone, working as hunters, trappers, guides, traders, and farmers. So, in other words, there is this idea. Oh, I'm going to try and get out of this if I can. Stop screen share. There is this idea that Métis are somehow indelibly different or indelibly separate from the Indigenous kin that they engaged with, that we lived with. And that's a problem. Not just from the perspective of me being a whiny Métis academic, talking about how unfair it is that we're seen as mixed. It has a powerful impact on what we think about indigeneity more generally. It has a powerful impact on how we understand Indigenous territoriality, and it ultimately has a powerful impact on how we understand Indigenous relationships to place and to each other. And with that, I will end. So thank you very much for listening to my rambling.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was a fantastic talk, and greatly appreciate everything that you highlighted in it. The questions are coming in, so let me turn it over to Brendan Rensink, who has the first question.
Bring it, Rensink.
Oh, am I able to unmute myself?
Yep.
Oh, great. So I'm interested in some of the ongoing, headlines we see about faux or pretendians in Canada and the United States, and these many kind of self-proclaimed Métis communities that are popping up in Canada, in the Maritimes or places not traditionally associated, like with Red River Métis. And I'm interested in how this intersects, or how this should inform, how we think about these issues you're talking about of museum or other popular representations of Métis peoples, of erasure or misrepresentations of them. How does this ongoing issue of people co-opting Indigenous identity play into these issues you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question, and having talked with several curator friends, it's certainly something that they're aware of in a museum context. And I will just kind of say that one of the things that often happens when those kind of what people like to call the Feti tend to talk about is that they don't want to talk about kind of existing kinship relationships. They want to talk about kind of historical genealogical connections. Brenda, I don't know if Brenda Bugel's on the call, but Brenda's written a lot about kind of thinking about the difference between genealogy on the one hand and kinship on the other. And so when you push back on the idea that people are Métis by virtue of the fact that they found an ancestor from way back in the archives, the argument that you always get in return is, well, but it's first of all, how dare you question me on my self-identification? My ancestors and my families have hid in plain sight for 300 years, and now it's finally safe enough again for us to self-identify, and we have to put up with this. But what they don't want to do is to talk about who they're related to and who they're connected to, and what those kinship obligations are in a contemporary ongoing context. And I will also say, and this is not something that a lot of Métis want to hear, is that legit Métis sometimes do that as well. People who have legit connections but don't make any attempt to renew them, that's an issue as well. But there's a difference between being a bad relative and being someone who is just kind of reaching way, way back into the past. In terms of how that plays itself out, I think kinship is an interesting way of giving, there's some potential for kind of unracializing the way in which we think about Métis, although kinship can, of course, itself be racialized as well and has been. But to me, when we think about these kinds of things, it's always, well, in relation to what? Because otherwise we get into these utopian discussions about, well, kinship has this problem and has that problem. Yeah, sure. But when you focus on kinship rather than, say, mixed ancestry, you get more sophisticated questions and more sophisticated discussions than those that come from kind of a straight ahead racialization. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of partly how I think about these things.
Thank you. Thanks, Brendan, for the question. The next question, and this is always a little bit weird because you know, in these forums, like people normally introduce themselves, but you have to like sort of make guesses on names. So I apologize for anybody if I mess up your name. Deep apologies. Ian Caillou has the next question.
Tansy, Chris, for your talk. I don't know if you can hear me. I was wondering if you see this a question of identity noted by the British Museum as an extension of the colonial practice of delegitimizing Canadian, like delegitimizing kinship that was practiced in Canada, and then practice used through things like scrip to solve sort of the Indian question in Confederation. And you see this practice as different in America, where citizenship is much more different and seemingly more akin to kinship in some cases. And I'm thinking specifically of, I don't know if you know Jocko Finlay, who is quite a prominent Métis. He cut the trail for Thompson as he crossed the Rockies, but he settled in northern Washington, and his has something like 40,000 descendants now, and they're all considered to be sort of members of much like the tribal communities there, and it's sort of taken for granted that he's as much as part of those communities as he was his sort of original heritage, which I believe is Chippewa, from northern Manitoba.
Sorry, can you repeat the question part of that?
Well, I was just wondering if you see this sort of the British Museum practice as sort of this extension of Canada's practice of delegitimizing kinship, rather than its own sort of isolated aspect of identifying. Because I think Canada's done a good job of alienating Indigenous Métis people, and scrip being one of them. I don't know if people know what scrip is, but essentially that the practice of getting Métis people off of the rolls, so to speak.
Yeah, I will say that the answer to your question kind of is yes, but I want to be very clear that it's a structural issue. It's not kind of, as I said, it's not idiosyncratic to the British Museum itself. I spent 2 weeks there. I guess it was 2015. They were incredibly generous to me in terms of opening up the files for the museum, so I could kind of read through the history of how it got created, all of that kind of stuff. And just as kind of a brief digression, it turns out that 95% of the files and the work that was done in the exhibit was how to make sure that the temperature inside of a curatorial box stayed within 2 degrees of temperature, whether you had 1 person in the room or 100 people in the room. Like that took up like far more of their time than their money, kind of than these broader discussions about kind of identity and that kind of stuff. So yes, I do think they do that, but I also think that the way in which we more broadly think about Métis and how little we think about kind of kinship in terms of interrelationships makes that very easy to do. And historians do it, and ethnohistorians do it, and anthropologists do it. So this is kind of certainly not limited to the British Museum. This is kind of an ongoing structural issue, and it's wrapped in all these, not even wrapped, it's caked in all these layers of kind of victimhood and defensiveness and all this kind of stuff that makes it very difficult to kind of talk about in a contemporary context. But it's a great question, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. Next question is Emily McFadden.
Hi.
Oh, can't hear you, Emily.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
There you go. Okay, so thank you for your presentation and for the humor. That was wonderful. So I was wondering if this potential erasure and misrepresentation seen in the museum exhibits reflect a possibility that Indigenous peoples are not present in the decision-making of these exhibits or telling of the story.
Yes.
And then if you could expand a little bit on that, because that is an interesting part in and of itself.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great point. I do think that museums around the world have kind of in fits and starts begun to attempt to build kind of stronger relationships. I was talking with a colleague of mine and sort of bouncing around this idea that kinship is relational, obviously, but kind of thinking about how to describe artifacts should be relational as well. And so when I talked briefly in my presentation about the fact that museums are not just forms of power, but they're forums of power, starting to think about what voices are in the room and what voices get to speak on particular kinds of issues becomes an important part of kind of solving the Rubik's Cube of that issue. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think museums are, I don't want to kind of turn this into kind of a bash on museum session, because I think like many public institutions, museums are under constrained resources, less people to do more kinds of things. And I think there are some curators who are doing kind of a hero's labor in terms of kind of building and maintaining relationships with Indigenous communities, but sort of as a logical pathway forward, thinking about what relationality means to kind of imbue exhibits, I think is a great place to kind of to think about starting.
Thanks, Emily. Our next question comes from Kiara Broadhead.
Thanks for your presentation. My question, I just kind of wanted a little bit more background, and I should have done this research before your presentation. But do the Métis and the other First Nations people of Canada, do they have the same blood quantum requirements like the tribes here in the US have? This is a point of interest to me just based on my own family. My family at my dad's generation is split. He's enrolled in a tribe, and his siblings aren't, just based on the date that they placed a blood quantum requirement. And it just seems like these ideas of blood quantum really relate to the concept of racialization, specifically when you were talking about being less than other Indigenous groups, because from my own personal experience with my family and my friends and my extended family, it just seems like whether or not you're a card-carrying member or not has really large and extending implications on, I guess, just on everything, on identity, on kinship, on everything. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that and how that plays out in Canada as well.
Yeah, we don't tend to use kind of terminology like blood quantum in Canada, but if we think back to kind of the difference between kind of, you know, again, categories of practice and categories of analysis, there for a long time when First Nations controlled their band membership, there were cutoffs kind of based on who your kind of parents were, and then there were not who your parents were, but kind of the kind of, if you will, ethnic makeup of your parents. And then Indian Affairs in Canada had its own kind of what many Americans would recognize as kind of a fractional or blood quantum tree as well. But there have been several court cases that have come out in the last 5 years that's thrown that all into disarray, both in terms of defining who and who is not Indian, and then also defining what the federal government in Canada is responsible for under Section 9124, which is the part of the legislation through which they gave themselves responsibility over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So it's kind of really up in the air at the moment in terms of what that looks like. But I will say that one thing I noticed kind of in the Faculty of Native Studies is that often when we teach courses on this kind of stuff, there are all kinds of ways in which authenticity plays itself out. So whether or not you kind of grew up in a community or not, whether you kind of look a particular way or not. So there's all these different ways in which kind of these notions of what are essentially racial purity play themselves out in an everyday basis. And I know it's kind of, it seems like natural that we want to kind of shit on the idea of blood quantum, but I remember something that Kim Tallbear once said to me, and she didn't intend it this way, but it's always stuck with me when she was looking at a blood quantum chart from the States, and she said, people look at those and see fractions. I look at them and I see relatives. So there's more than one way to kind of think about those kinds of things. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's similar, but kind of, it's very nationally specific in context in Canada.
Thank you for that question. I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from someone who actually does not have a camera or a mic on their computer right now, so I will just ask the question for them. So this comes from Bobby Demare, and I think it's a specific question, but I also think it has like a much broader question associated with it too. So Bobby says, as a Canadian Indigenous person living in London, is there a person or department I can contact to question them about the wording of the exhibit that excludes the Métis people in the exhibit? And then I think maybe the broader question is, what are things that we, right, academics, members of the public, et cetera, can do to ensure, that museums are providing proper context and in their exhibits?
Yeah, I don't have a firm answer to that, because I didn't get the sense that they were planning a refurb of that exhibit anytime soon. But there is a consulate, a Canadian consulate in London, and there is people that do public relations at the British Museum, and there's also people in the Métis National Council that could be contacted to kind of put this on their plate, or put this on put this kind of onto their bandwidth. Can you put something onto a bandwidth? Probably not. I'm starting to kind of like fry out at this point, but yeah, that would be my suggestion. And also to kind of throw one of my good friends under the bus, you could contact Dr. David Stirrup at the University of Kent, who runs the Beyond the Spectacle project, because they've been doing some amazing stuff around connecting Indigenous people outside of the UK to things that are going on in the UK.
So thank you so much. So I think we're right at time. So I just want to thank you, Dean Anderson, for this excellent talk and talking about an issue of critical importance. I'm glad that we could include Indigenous voices into this series on race this semester. So thank you for doing that. And I know everybody's muted, but you can either unmute or just do the emoji thing. And we want to thank you for your time and for your preparation and everything else. And we're sorry that we could not bring you down to Utah, but we will make it up to you in the future.
Oh, no worries. Thank you all for taking time out of your days to come and listen. And yeah, you can email me if there was dumb stuff that I said that you were gracious enough not to call me out on over Zoom here. Happy to kind of engage in discussions with you that way as well. But other than that, thank you all very much for taking time out of your day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.